All right, welcome everyone to the CCPO-ICAR seminar series on November 7th, 2022. And we're excited to have Dr. Malgosia Madajewicz, who is an associate research scientist at the Center for Climate Systems Research at the Climate School, Columbia University. She is an economist with research expertise in social vulnerability and adaptation to climate variability and change, evaluation of programs and policies, governance, economic development, inequality, and poverty. She holds a PhD in economics from Harvard University and has served on the community-based adaptation working group of the New York City panel on climate change and is currently a member of the Westchester County Climate Task Force. Dr. Madajewicz will be talking to us today about co-producing adaptation to flooding in urban communities, a case study of Rockaway Peninsula in New York City. We will have questions at the end, so I ask that if you do have questions and you worry about forgetting them, please ask them in the chat. Otherwise, at the conclusion of the presentation, you can unmute yourself and ask your questions. Malgosia, go ahead.
Great, thank you very much. And thank you for inviting me to give this presentation. So, yeah, thank you again. You have the title up on the screen. I have a number. I want to first gratefully acknowledge NOAA funding that made this work possible through several different grants. I have a team a very interdisciplinary team that I conducted this work with. So I'm the PI. My co-PIs are Philip Orton, who's an oceanographer at the Stevens Institute of Technology, Michaela Labriol, who's an educator at the New York Hall of Science, Michaela's colleague Judith Hutton at the Hall of Science, Anna Fisiak and Judah Asimov, who were at the Rockaway Initiative for Sustainability and Equity, which I'll refer to as RISE, at the time of this project. And RISE is our community partner who helps us with outreach to the communities as well as developing materials for this project and a number of students. So the goal of this work, the overall goal, is to improve urban homeowners' capacity to adapt to flooding. And I'll explain some pieces of that as I go along. So the first thing I'm going to do is describe the setting to you a little bit where we're doing the work. The setting is the Rockaway Peninsula in New York City, which is this marked with an oval on this map. The map shows the extent of the current projections for the 100-year flood in New York City. In this darker blue color that you see on the peninsula. So in Rockaway the Rockaway Peninsula is in the southern part of the city. You're looking at the southern part here. Sorry, I'm going to put my laser back on. This is John F. Kennedy Airport. This is Queens over here. This is Brooklyn, if you're at all familiar with New York City. Sorry, I've got a frog in my throat. Manhattan is up there off the map. This area, between the Rockaway Peninsula and the mainland is Jamaica Bay, which is an area of water and marshes with a big ecosystem. This entire area, the flood risk here is increasing rapidly. Pretty much everywhere along the coast in New York City, but particularly here, the whole area was devastated by Hurricane Sandy exactly 10 years ago. And a lot of people are still recovering from Hurricane Sandy. It's a densely populated urban area, but it has a higher percentage of low-rise housing than the rest of New York City does. And that's important because low-rise housing tends to be more susceptible to damage from flooding than higher rise housing. It's also a very diverse area. So I was just saying in our pre-seminar conversation, interestingly, these oceanfront, so, whoops, sorry, I need to do that. So the Rockaways, this coast here faces the ocean. So this is the Atlantic Ocean. coastline that faces the ocean does not have very much wealth on it at all. You often associate coastal areas with a lot of wealth. It's true in parts of New Jersey and out on Long Island, but not in the city. So these are very much middle to low income communities. So the western end of the peninsula is solidly middle class, very white. The middle is sort of a transitional area with a big mix. And the eastern end is very low income, mostly African American and Hispanic. And it's a part of the city that hasn't received much investment from the city historically. The city has engaged in this area quite a bit since Hurricane Sandy to try to motivate people to start adapting to flooding without much success. So there hasn't been much movement on that front. Not many people have been taking action. And it is important for so making progress on adaptation to flooding, and I may not need to be saying this to this audience, but it does require action on the part of residents. So the city is contemplating a lot of investment in reducing flood risk. So for example, one of the things that's been contemplated is a gate across the mouth of Jamaica Bay. So it's a multiple billion-dollar project. Even if the gate gets built, which will take a long time, it'll only be closed for very large storms, because otherwise you would kill the entire ecosystem in Jamaica Bay. And from related research that we're doing, we're finding that right now, the bulk of damages from coastal flooding is being driven by the larger, less frequent, more intense storms, such as the 100-year storm. But over the next 30 years, that distribution is going to shift towards 10-year storms. So 30 years from now, the bulk of damages is going to be driven by the more frequent, less intense storms for which the gate is not likely to close. So regardless of what public investment there's going to be residual flood risk that communities are going to be facing. To the extent that communities are staying in place and there is not yet an active conversation about moving these communities away, there needs to be adaptation in place that happens. Otherwise, there needs to be a conversation about relocation. So not much of that is happening yet. So the knowledge gap that this work is trying to address is what are effective approaches to influencing adaptation behavior among different population groups, among coastal residents. And more specifically, the objectives are, so the first objective is to develop an approach to influencing adaptation behavior. And that approach is co-producing understanding of flood risks and homeowners' flood adaptation options and their benefits and costs. So let me explain this objective a little bit. There are a couple of words here that I want to focus on. The first word is understanding flood risks and adaptation options. Why is it the knowledge piece of this that we're focusing on? We're basically want to see if influencing knowledge translates into changes in behavior. And that is, the literature has evidence both pro and con as to whether knowledge can influence behavior. But from our previous work, so we've been collecting data in the Rockaway since 2014 to document impacts of and recovery from Hurricane Sandy. And that work, one of the things that comes through clearly is that there is a surprising lack of awareness around the changing flood risk. So people are hearing about sea level rise, and ever since Hurricane Sandy, again, the city has been engaging with these communities talking about sea level rise. but that's not getting translated into perceptions of risk where the residents are living. So the majority of respondents to our surveys do not expect flood risk to increase over time. They expect it to either decrease or stay the same. And similarly, there's very little awareness of adaptation options. So the city has been emphasizing raising homes. And people, by and large, are aware that they have the option to raise homes. But most people, the great majority of people in this area say, they can't afford to raise their home. There hasn't been much help available with raising homes. People have taken advantage of the little help there has been. So they feel that, that there's nothing they can do about the problem anyway, and they might as well just not worry about it. So so we're trying to influence the knowledge, the understanding as a sort of first step, trying to see if that sort of moves the needle on behavior. The other thing is that we're focusing on what individual homeowners can do. And that's, like we were just discussing again in the conversation, it's controversial, because what if your home is raised and you're perfectly safe in it during a flood? What happens after the flood? Do you have a street you can walk on? Do you have transportation that goes anywhere? Do you have any public services available to you? Is there still a community for you to be living in? So clearly, adaptation to flooding is a collective action problem. It needs to be done through a planning process. The hypothesis that we're testing here is whether you need to engage with residents at the level of their individual home through the decisions that an individual homeowner can do, that they need to understand what that looks like before they'll engage in a broader planning process to address the problem. The other piece of this is that we're focusing on homeowners rather than renters. And that's because, again, it's coming from prior research on recovery from Hurricane Sandy that showed that middle to low income homeowners, which is the population in this area, were the least resilient after Sandy. And having been sort of financially wiped out by the recovery after Hurricane Sandy, they're most vulnerable to future storms. And the last piece of this that I want to focus on is the co-production. So co-production is referring to collaboration between decision makers and scientists to develop a set of information or an approach to adaptation. And I'm sure you've all heard a lot about it. There's a growing consensus that co-production leads to the development of more effective adaptation approaches than if they're done in a sort of without the co-production component. At the same time, there's actually not a lot of evidence beyond descriptive and anecdotal on how effective co-production is in terms of the outcomes that it produces. And there's beginning to be more and more literature on the fact that co-production does require a lot of resources, a lot of investment of time that especially low-income communities just may not be able to give. And so, what is the appropriate role of co-production given the capacity of especially communities to participate in the adaptation planning process? So the other objective here, that's a component of this research. So one component is to design this an approach to adaptation through co-production. The other one is to evaluate the effectiveness and the appropriate role of co-production in influencing flood adaptation behavior. So this is, you may think, I don't know to what extent many of you are familiar with evaluation as research. It's actually what's called program evaluation is actually a research subspecialty in the social sciences and economics, political science, sociology. Outside of the social sciences, it's often thought of in the context of administration and reporting. But here it's more in a research capacity, sort of understanding, who benefits from co-production, how and why, and what is its appropriate role. So the approach here, in a minute, I'll explain the intervention, that co-production piece. And the other piece is the evaluation research design, which I'll just go over really quickly because I know we have a diversity of folks in the audience. If there is more interest in going in detail into the research design, I'm happy to do that in the discussion, the questions and answers later. But for now, I'm just going to summarize it briefly. So for the evaluation component, we collected data through a baseline survey before we started the intervention and a follow-up survey a year later after our intervention was complete. And we're going to be, we actually haven't done the interviews yet. We're going to be doing those. The evaluation piece, the evaluation research piece of this is actually work in progress. I haven't finished all the data analysis yet, and there's a little bit of data collection left to do. We're taking a mixed method approach. So we're going to be investigating the contribution that this process makes to adaptation planning by the communities, by residents, based on transcripts of workshops, meetings, and eventually interviews. But we also have a component that's looking at attribution, which is actually causal inference. So this is a methodology that, again, is used widely in the social sciences and for understanding the effectiveness of social and development programs. It's rarely it's part of a suite of methods that's rarely been applied to understanding the effectiveness of adaptation programs. This particular approach, the difference in difference regression analysis, if you're not familiar with it, is based on comparing outcomes between the change in outcomes from baseline to follow-up, comparing that between participating groups and non-participating groups, which are sort of the control group, where the non-participants represent what the world would have looked like if the intervention did not happen. And in this case, what we're comparing our co-production intervention to is a group that's, that only had access to those, to that broad range of engagement programs run by the city, which include various approaches such as online information and non-co-production based workshops. So we'll be comparing the change in outcomes from our intervention to the change in outcomes among people who were both the treatment and the control groups had access to the city's engagement programs. It's just that the participant group had, in addition, had access to our intervention. And then, of course, we integrate the results from the two different approaches. And one thing I should point out is there's only 1 year between baseline and follow-up. So in terms of us being able to document outcomes of the change in outcomes resulting from the program, there's only so much that can change during a year. Expecting behavior, especially adaptation investments, to take place over a year of time is a little bit heroic, just that process takes longer. So this is something that we hope to continue in the future. So by the way, I can't see people at all. So I don't know if there are hands up. If anybody wants to ask a question, somebody needs to interrupt me and tell me so. But I'll just move on and describe the intervention that we developed. So we partnered with 10 civic and homeowner associations in the Rockaways. And as part of that evaluation design, 5 of them participated in the co-production process. 5 participated in data collection, but not the co-production process. And with the leaders of those 5 groups that participated in the co-production process, we developed a series of 3 workshops, 1 on flood risk and 2 on adaptation options. And we repeated that series of 3 workshops twice with different participants. And so our leaders, the civic and homeowner association leaders who worked with us, what they sort of worked with us on doing is really focusing the material on what individual homeowners can do, as I explained before, with information tailored to decisions that homeowners make. And the workshops were very interactive, not lecture-based at all. So what I'm going to do in the next couple of slides is I'll go really quickly through the kind of material that we developed for the workshops, and then I'll tell you some of our preliminary results. So I'm going to sort of fly through this because it's a lot, and we could spend a lot of time talking about it, but if they may be in discussion, we can focus on those points that people are interested in. So sort of the first thing that we did that was new to our participants, to the community group members who are participating in our effort, is that we developed maps at a neighborhood level, which they hadn't really seen before. We split up the Rockaways into 3 parts as to sort of zoom in. And for each part, we developed flood maps that showed depth of flooding, not just extent, which is something people hadn't seen before, and a range of flood return frequencies. So people had seen the 1% chance annual flood, which is what I'm showing you here, but they hadn't seen the sort of higher frequency floods that are going to be responsible for more of the damages in the coming years. So the maps, this is what the maps look like. We developed, so it was the 1% chance flood currently and in 30 years. People wanted us to focus on that, you know, kind of home mortgage time frame of 30 years. The colors, by the way, are flood depth. The blues are smaller, lower water levels. The reds are the highest water levels. The dark red goes up to 5 feet. So that's how much worse it looks. Then we showed them photos of a local landmark, was showing where the water is on that landmark now and 30 years from now. Then we did the same thing with the 10% annual chance flood, which people hadn't really thought about or hadn't seen. And this one, New York City, is really overdue for one. And that's what's going to drive most of the damages increasingly over the next 30 years. So that's now, that's 30 years from now. Again, photos and the annual chance flood, which the extent of that is also increasing. And again, photos. We then, when we proceeded to talk about adaptation options, we did it in the context of an example. So we had a family. We put a name on them. We gave them an address in the local area. And for that address, we showed people what those flood levels that we had been discussing, what they are specifically at that address and what that does to the home now and 30 years from now with the different frequency floods, also explaining there are flood frequencies in between these. It's a continuum, but we are just giving 3 examples. And then the main component really was what folks completely hadn't seen before and probably had the biggest impact out of anything that we did, which is we talked about what expenses they can expect to face from the future flooding. So we had collected data on what people spent on recovery after Hurricane Sandy. And that was good data for us to base these future damages on, because people rebuilt in New York, people rebuilt after Hurricane Sandy exactly as it was before. There was no resilience built in, basically. So we're pretty much where we were in terms of resilience of housing, of residential housing along the coast. We're pretty much where we were then. So at that particular address for that example, over the next 15 years, on average, the family can expect to spend about $500,000 on flood damages if they don't do anything to reduce those damages, if they don't invest in protections. Over the next 30 years, that goes up to $1,700,000. So of course, people had questions, how do you get a number that's a multiple of what the house is worth? And that led to, so we developed a specific example of how you get to that number. And of course, it has to do with repetitive flooding, increasing frequency of flooding, not necessarily, we didn't even have a 100-year storm in that scenario that produced the 1,700,000. We didn't even have a Sandy. It was all sort of higher frequency, lower intensity flooding, but increasingly frequent. And that was a big shock to people. And then what we talked about, we went through a broad range of what the people could do in their homes to reduce future flood damages. So, but the benefit of these actions that we gave people was reduction in future flood damages. And then we showed them what the investment may cost them. And I'm only showing you a couple of examples here: raising mechanicals, flood-proofing the basement, raising the house. We did a much broader set of examples. And for each person, we asked people if they wanted this kind of assessment of benefits and costs. So what would be the benefits of each of a range of actions at their home, at their address? And anybody who wanted such an assessment, any of the workshop participants who wanted one, we developed it for them. We also showed people that the expenses that they can expect over the next 30 years vary a lot depending on the elevation of the lowest floor of their house. So where they are in the Rockaways, what the elevation of the lowest, and whether they have a basement or not, what the elevation of their lowest floor is, really affects what makes sense for them to do. As you can see, there's a big drop off in future costs between about 1.5 feet and 3 feet, somewhere in there. So we discussed that a bit. Okay, so that's those were sort of the main aspects of the intervention. And just to go over our preliminary results, again, we're not completely done with the analysis. Just the first couple of points are regarding the context. You know, in some areas, adaptation to flooding isn't happening because people have bigger, more immediate problems to deal with. I know in Virginia, flooding is a major issue. In New York, you know, we're seeing floods a lot less frequently. But in the Rockaways, based on our baseline survey, when we asked people what are the biggest challenges of living in the Rockaways, flooding was the most frequently cited challenge. Interestingly, I was somewhat surprised by that. Not many people are thinking about moving away from the Rockaways. This is an area where there are a lot of families that have been there for generations. People are very attached to the place. But among the quarter of respondents who are thinking about moving away, about a third, the second most frequently cited reason was flooding. Again, most people report being very attached, living in close-knit communities. So the conversation about moving away is a very difficult one. So we did find some effects on sort of, so I had said that there was a year between baseline and follow-up. So there's a limit on the kind of effects of our intervention that we might expect to see over this time period. We're more likely to see a change in knowledge, maybe a change in attitudes and in plans, than a change in actual behavior and actual investments that people have made. So we started by looking at awareness. And so just sort of qualitatively, what we're hearing back from our respondents is that indeed, what we did succeed at is that the workshops delivered information that was new to people. It wasn't what they had been. The concern at the beginning, everyone's concern of the participants, was that they had been sort of contacted or there have been sorry, backtrack. So keep in mind, who we are working with here, we're quite intentionally working with members of community groups. of homeowner and civic associations, right? So we're working with a population that's organized and very aware and very engaged. We're not working with a random sample from the population in the Rockaways. And that's intentional because, as I said, people are not taking adaptation actions. Working with sort of a random set of the population probably wouldn't get us very far. What we want to see is how much progress can we make with those who are most organized and engaged and who have potentially the capacity to disseminate that knowledge and disseminate the example of their behavior to the rest of their communities. We sort of, over a longer period of time, we want to study that process. So we are talking to people who are, as informed as they get. And these are the people who participated a lot in the engagements that the city offered. In fact, they felt quite burned out by all the engagements they participated in. And they were concerned that they were going to be getting more of the same information from us. So their particular concern was, what can you deliver that's new? And this, the information that is specific to decisions that homeowners can make was new. And people were saying that it was key to changing minds. Interestingly, I had told you before that from our prior work, the majority of people did not expect flooding to become more frequent in the future. Even in our follow-up, that's still true. The percentage who expect future flooding to be more frequent went up, but it's still below half of it's still below half. But on the other hand, overwhelmingly, people expect expenses associated with flood damages to increase, and the increase in expectation of the expenses went up much more among participating community groups than non-participating ones, even those members of those community groups who didn't participate in the workshops, but they're members of the groups. And that's from that difference analysis that I told you about. So what this suggests is that people don't expect floods to become more frequent, but expect them to become more intense, which is somewhat concerning because they're not, with that understanding, they're not quite preparing for the right thing, because a lot of the effect on future damages is going to be from floods becoming more frequent. The effect on intensity of flooding is actually a little bit more uncertain. So there was an increase, thankfully, in people who report receiving flood information that's specific to their home, which they didn't have before at all. But that's not coming only from the information that we're providing, but one of the engagements that the city had developed for everyone is a website called floodhelpny.org, where you can go in, put your address in, and it'll tell you what flood zone you're in, how much flooding you can expect, and tell you about insurance and adaptation options. And interestingly, even among this most informed population that we're working with, at baseline, only 28% of our respondents knew about this website. And we seem to have increased the awareness of it a bit. The percentage of people who report not knowing what to do as a challenge to preparing for flooding has gone down quite a lot, actually, from 27 to 12%. So that's been an effect on awareness. Probably our biggest effect has been on attitudes, people's attitudes towards adaptation to flooding. So as I mentioned before, that kind of general information about increasing flood risk, sea level rise, led to sort of a feeling of lack of agency. People's attitudes were, I can't afford to raise my home. There's nothing I can do. I'm just not going to worry about this. The biggest change that's emerging from both from the qualitative and the quantitative work, that the analysis that we've done, is that this focus on individual risks that we had, like what happens at people's homes, even though that's not how we want people to adapt, but talking about that, improving people's understanding of what that risk is at their address where they live, has increased the sense of urgency and personal responsibility. So a sense that, oh my God, this is really something we need to start paying attention to. And it's residents who need to participate in addressing this problem, or we're not going to like where we end up. And people report that what's been driving that change in the sense of urgency and personal responsibility is the information being specific to decisions that they can actually make, so that they can sit down and think about, okay, well, am I actually going to do that? Can I afford to do that? If I don't do that, what are the consequences? How am I going to pay out $500,000 in flood damages to my house over the next 15 years? The financial component of the information was a really important component to people thinking through the financial consequences. The focus that the city had taken on really emphasizing raising homes, people found unproductive. So what our participants found empowering was the menu of strategies. Understanding that they had a menu of options, not dependent, and they could take a different approach depending on what their financial situation was, and that which option is right might be different for different people depending on the elevation of their home. So not everyone really, even in the Rockaways, not everyone necessarily needs to think about raising their home, assuming that the rest of the community can adapt. So there's still so that Rockaways is still livable. And the other component was the opportunity to discuss these issues, that the decisions, the information are much too complicated to be delivered online or in any kind of simple way. People really need to sit around talking to each other and to scientists in order to get their heads around what this means for them and for what they want to do. This was the sort of more qualitative piece. The more quantitative piece, from the difference in difference, it actually showed up there too, that the increase in percentage of respondents who report that residents are responsible for adaptation. They might also think the city is also responsible, but they are calling out residents as being responsible, increased a lot more among our participants than among the non-participating community groups. And the discussion of individual home level risks very immediately led to a discussion of planning, a collective planning process. Without our prompting it, our participants immediately started saying, all right, well, this is important for us to understand, but this is not how we're, we cannot approach adaptation one house at a time. We need to figure out how to go about this planning process. In terms of behavior, as I mentioned, we're looking at this over a short term where, this entire intervention was sort of a first step in a process of trying to catalyze and drive a change in adaptation behavior. So we're not expecting to see much in terms of change in actual behavior over 1 year of time. Just a few points based on the data that we collected among our workshop attendees. Over half has started talking about preparing for flooding in their families where they weren't doing that before. And much less, 13% have actually started taking action. Interestingly, perception of preparedness increased more among our participants than the non-participants, a lot more among our participants than non-participants. In terms of the bigger actions that people have been taking, so quite a few people have been taking small actions, very small actions, like getting a sump pump or tiling their basement floor or improving drainage. But in terms of bigger actions that can actually affect damages, the cost of damages over time, at baseline, not many people had taken action. At follow-up, it's not many more, but it's going in the right direction. It's what we would hope to see, that people are starting to do something. And maybe these people who are starting to do something can serve as an example in their communities and help this change in behavior propagate. Perhaps most interesting here, the one action that has a huge effect on future damages that people expenses of flood damages is flood-proofing the basement. That's like the biggest bang for the buck in terms of what people can do. And people just were not aware, our participants, people in our workshops were not aware of that option at all. That was not something that was on their radar in any way. Since our workshops, 5 participants report having actually done that, and 4 out of those 5 were members of the groups that participated in the workshops. So our preliminary conclusions at this point, just to summarize, is that the biggest effect that we see over the first year of what we've done is that the co-production, specifically the co-production component, rather than online information or other kind of engagement, influenced residents' attitudes. And it did so mainly by focusing on decision-relevant information in several different ways that I mentioned, giving space for discussion, especially because the decision problem information are too complex to be addressed through simpler means, not just online information. What remains challenging is interestingly, improving people's understanding of the nature of the flood risk, of that increasing, the fact that they need to be expecting increasing frequency. So that's something that we have to work on. And some of the challenges, some of the other challenges and next steps, the 2 biggest challenges that I feel like we need to incorporate in next iterations of this work. I see this work, I see this as sort of a first step in a long-term piece of work. What we've done here, what I've just described to you, is a first step in a longer plan. So one big challenge for the next steps is figuring out financing for adaptation actions. That is something even middle income residents say, you know, that they don't have the money even to flood-proof their basements, which is one of the lower cost, I mean, one of the medium cost options, let's say. So financing is a huge issue, and you know, the main source of financing at the moment are for preparation for flooding rather than flood recovery. It's FEMA funding that is structured in such a way that application has to go through the state. That's something that the city can do. But what is a community in a large city that is pretty much ignored by the city and underinvested? How does it get access to funding for these actions? The other big challenge is scaling up. So does the information, so again, the co-production process is very time resource intensive. Does the information and motivation to act, does it persist over time and disseminate in the community? And if so, how does that happen? That's something that we want to investigate over time, is what is the longer term effect here? Is there dissemination from this small piece that we started here? Our participants have said that they want to continue to organize, to plan and act, but they've identified a number of challenges. One is inadequate resources, not only in terms of funding adaptation, but just in the organization necessary to get community planning going in a community that doesn't kind of have a standalone governance structure. It's not a town, it's not a village. It's a set of neighborhoods. Anyway, the institutional structure there is challenging. Uncertainties and unknowns. What will the city invest in, and what will the residual risk be? What will other residents do, given that these actions have to be coordinated across areas that haven't traditionally worked together well, and addressing inequities across those areas. So that's it. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you very much. I hope I haven't gone on too long. I'm looking forward to your questions and comments.